welcome everybody to our session today. Boa tarde a todos. Agora eu vou dar aqui um pouco de trabalho, não vou dar muito trabalho à nossa tradutora, que vou falar em duas línguas ao mesmo tempo. Estamos muito contentes de ter aqui hoje este workshop, o primeiro workshop do projeto Rede Pares. Temos uma diversidade de participantes e uma diversidade de países. Temos colegas vindos de Portugal, colegas vindos da Itália, da Iceland, e ficamos muito satisfeitos com esta presença diversificada. Temos connosco aqui também a nossa oradora privilegiada, a professora Nicole Allen, que vem dos Estados Unidos e é uma especialista na construção de redes e da abordagem comunitária da intervenção na área da violência contra as mulheres. A doutora colega aqui, Felizmina Rosa Mendes, da Associação Cabo-Verdiana de Setúbal, é que vai apresentar a nossa oradora hoje aqui também em português. So welcome everybody. We are very happy to have you here. Oh, also Brazil here today with us. Hello. We are very happy to have you all on board. This is the first public event of the project, the EE Grants project, called Peer Network on Gender and Empowerment and Violence Prevention. And we are very, very happy to have you here with us. And so I would pass on the word to Ms. Felizmina so that she could present our participant, our main speaker today, and then we would move on for our session today. Thank you. Felizmina, you have the word.
Ok. Boa tarde a todos. Estão-me a ouvir? É um prazer estar aqui hoje neste nosso primeiro workshop da Rede Pares e tenho aqui o privilégio de apresentar um pouco aqui do currículo da professora Allen. Portanto, a professora Allen é professora no Departamento de Psicologia da Universidade de Illinois em Urbana-Champaign. A área de investigação da doutora Allen incide sobre os processos de mudança nos sistemas de respostas a questões sociais, principalmente a violência de género, e o papel dos contextos colaborativos, conselhos comunitários, task force, parcerias, e na facilitação dessa mudança. Nicole Allen tem estudado os percursos das pessoas em sistemas complexos, quer em sistemas formais, como o sistema de justiça criminal, segurança social, saúde, quer em sistemas informais, como contextos religiosos, irmandades e redes sociais. Tem ainda investigado a eficácia das intervenções sociais que visam mudar os contextos das vidas dos indivíduos para promover a saúde e o bem-estar, especialmente em intervenções na comunidade que visam desenvolver o ativismo e o Advocacy. Privilegia a investigação colaborativa feita em parceria com grupos comunitários. Nicole Allen é editora-chefe do American Journal of Community Psychology e lidera ainda a equipa de investigação do Action Research Collaboration. Acho que o meu sotaque não é muito bom, mas é isto, é um pequeno resumo, portanto, de o que é que esta grande mulher faz, portanto, no mundo daqui, dessas dinâmicas que nos são caras para nós que trabalhamos na área do social e das comunidades.
Uhum. Muito obrigada, Felizmina. Só uma informação de base, na parte inferior do vosso ecrã encontram um símbolo que é um mundozinho, que é uma interpretação, esta sessão vai ser também emitida em língua portuguesa, portanto, porque a nossa oradora vai falar em inglês, mas podem ter acesso a uma tradução de português, basta clicar no símbolo, escolher português e a partir de agora poderão ouvir em 2 canais, um canal em português e a professora Nicole Allen a falar. Nicole, I would pass on the word to you. You have the floor. Thank you again for being here with us. We are very proud. We have a long time knowledge of our joint work, so we are very proud that you are here with us today.
So I think everybody can see my screen now. Bon tarde, good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to be here with all of you. I still am not used to just speaking to a screen. And so I have to imagine all of you there. I have to imagine us interacting and the energy and exchange that we have. So I'm very pleased to be with you. And as Maria said, we have a long history of working together at various points. And I'm very excited today to talk about community-based advocacy. And I'm going to be talking about a program that has primarily been developed and implemented in the context of the United States, but there's also been work to bring this program to Mexico. And there's been some other international interest in the program. But I want to acknowledge this because I don't assume that everything that I typically have in this training is relevant necessarily in a Portuguese context, in a Brazilian context, in the context of Iceland or Italy. And so I want to acknowledge that. So I also want to learn from you all where you say, well, that would be a little bit different here. But I want to talk to you today about the Community Advocacy Project, which is a particular approach to engaging in community-based intervention with survivors of interpersonal violence. The research base on this approach to intervention is primarily with survivors of intimate partner violence, but we have also utilized this model with survivors of sexual assault, as well as an adaptation for girls involved in the juvenile justice system in the United States. So girls at risk for involvement in that criminal processing system or who were caught up in that criminal processing system. And so it's a very adaptable model to different populations. And what I want to do today is introduce you to the underlying philosophy and approach. And for those of you who are familiar with the field of community psychology, it's going to feel very familiar. And then I'm going to provide an overview of the way that this intervention approaches community-based advocacy, just to give you a feeling for it. And I'm going to be covering a lot of ground in a relatively short period of time. And so I would invite your questions throughout. If you raise your hand using the raise hand function, that's probably the easiest way to do it. And I'm hopefully will have time at the end too for your questions. So normally I would do this as an exercise, and I'm actually going to pass on that because I want to make sure that I have enough time to get through the material. But often when I start talking about community advocacy, sometimes I'm talking about it with people who are very, very familiar with intimate partner violence. And sometimes I'm talking about it with people who are relatively new to that work. And I'm guessing that most of you here have some familiarity with intimate partner violence, with interpersonal violence and its effects and its causes. But I often ask people to think about 1- and 2-word phrases that come to mind when you think about people abused by intimate partners. And I always say to people, be candid, be honest. What comes to mind right away? So if you all just take a moment to do that silently. People with abusive partners, what are the first couple of words that come to mind? So when we do this exercise, part of why I like the exercise is because it reveals for people, when I think about people with abusive partners, what immediately comes to mind. And there's often narratives that come up like they're afraid, they're stuck, they're alone, they're isolated. they might be depressed. They're negatively affected by the abuse they're experiencing. And a lot of times there's a lot of these words that arise that are more oriented toward deficits or what's going wrong. And the other thing that happens is that sometimes people also focus on strengths. And I'm imagining this would vary context to context. But one of the things that often happens is that the deficits that come up, the way we think about what's going wrong, come up more easily than an orientation to strengths and what's going right. And so when we think about intimate partner violence, just to be roughly on the same page here, I'm talking about any behavior within an intimate relationship that causes physical, psychological, or sexual harm to those in the relationship. And this can include acts of physical violence, but also emotional or psychological abuse, and also controlling behaviors. And this is a definition from the World Health Organization. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about what intimate partner violence is because I want to focus mostly on the response. But in community advocacy, we think about intimate partner violence in terms of power and control. So there are competing theories about why intimate partner violence is so prevalent. Some people say, well, it's because of failed ability to approach conflict in the relationship. That's one problem definition. But we're really thinking of a socio-cultural, structural problem definition, where we're thinking about a context of power and control that emerges in the context of the relationship. And I think there's a power and control wheel, of course, also translated into Portuguese. There are many, many power and control wheels. In the United States, there's power and control wheels focused on the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community. There's power and control wheels focused on women who have immigration, who are immigrants. There's power and control wheels focused on our Native American community. So there's a lot of different ways that these dimensions will emerge. But what's important here is that we want to think about intimate partner violence in a socio-structural way because our problem definitions matter for the way that we intervene. And I want to start off by telling you some of the assumptions that we have in the way that we approach community advocacy. And one of these assumptions is that intimate partner violence is far too widespread to be attributed to intrapsychic dysfunction or relationship problems. Can anyone tell me quickly in your country of origin what your understanding is of the current rate of intimate partner violence in your country? Do you know? If anyone knows and can drop it in the chat, go ahead. But some recent statistics in the United States suggest that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men report a form of violence in lifetime incidents in the context of their intimate relationship. When you ask about consequences of that violence, 1 in 3 women report a consequence or an impact from that violence, and 1 in 10 men. And so we know this is quite common. We also have a critical assumption that intimate partner violence is tolerated, if not condoned, by many segments of society. So something that is this widespread is often not so widespread if it doesn't have also community support in terms of culture, norms, and values that makes that practice possible, that upholds it within the community, right? And so a lot of the work we do in a movement is to counter that narrative and create a new one, right? That says, no, this is not acceptable behavior in the home. We need to go in a different direction. We also view people with abusive partners are by and large active help seekers who go to great lengths to protect themselves and their children. In the context of the United States, we hear a lot in formal systems, but also informally from family and friends. Why doesn't she just leave? Does this also happen in the context of your countries, this question, why doesn't she just leave? So when we ask that question, we're putting responsibility for leaving on the person who's surviving that violence. And that is a form of victim blaming. But when research looks at help seeking, what we find is actually people engage in a high level of help seeking, but those systems are inadequate to support and respond to them. And then the last critical assumption is that the community response to domestic violence is a critical factor in whether a victim will be victimized and re-victimized by an intimate partner or an ex-partner. And this is where we're saying we have a role to play. As a community, we have a role to play in addressing this widespread form of violence. So these are some of our assumptions, some of the ways that we define the problem. Now, part of what is challenging about community advocacy, you may have noticed in the first slide that I said that community advocacy was developed in the 1990s. It was developed by Dr. Chris Sullivan. She developed it in collaboration with domestic violence survivors and also based on the research literature around effective intervention. But community advocacy still represents a departure from the way, at least in the United States context, and I'd be very curious to learn what's going on in your countries, services as usual, right? So if you think about human services, there are many, many efforts in the US context to reform that system. So we have systems of care and wraparound services and family-centered services and family-driven youth guided and individualized service movements and strengths-based movements and a movement to non-categorical service. And these all share values with community advocacy. So while how is, community advocacy a paradigm shift? What are we shifting in community advocacy? And the way that we think about this juxtaposition when we think about what we're trying to do with community advocacy, which I'm going to describe more fully soon, is that we want to shift the way that we are engaging with survivors away from a more traditional human service approach. So in the context of the US, and I would imagine there's some shared similarities here, given the influence on human service infrastructure. Does anyone have a guess about which model is the dominant model that human service delivery, so all of our social services, our mental health services, what it is based on historically? And you may have a different historical context. Does anyone have ideas about what the model is, what the paradigm that guides our work often with survivors of domestic violence? I give a hint here in this picture I put here because I put a stethoscope there. And in the US context, and this may be somewhat different historical context in Portugal, Italy, Iceland, and Brazil, we are very reliant on a medical model, And the interesting thing about paradigms is that paradigms are often invisible to us. What are they? They're frameworks. They're ways that help us think about the way we do our work, except often they're invisible to us. We don't name the paradigm. We don't say, okay, this is the particular approach we're taking. So the first thing that we do when we train in community advocacy is we want to reveal the pond we say that we're swimming in. We want to be able to see the water around us. What are the dominant narratives and the way we approach this work? So we want to reveal the paradigm. So in the United States context, we have become very top-down, expert-driven in the way that we approach human service delivery. And this is true in the way that we approach service delivery with survivors. And it's a part of what I think is so exciting about the work that you all are doing around peer networks, prevention, and gender empowerment, because that really moves away from this way of thinking of, okay, there's these survivors of violence, they're needy, we have to help them, and it's very top down in that approach. So the medical model, I have some of the components of it here. It tends to be, the expertise tends to reside in the doctor. The expertise tends to reside in the professional. Medical services are well known for how categorical they are. A friend of mine had a problem with her ankle, and so she would go to one doctor and they'd say, you have to go to a podiatrist. And then she'd go to another doctor and they say, you have to go to an orthopedist, because no one was sure who does the ankle, who will help her with her ankle where her foot meets her leg, right? And that's an extreme example, but we have a lot of specialization and we have adopted that in human services. We have a lot of non-comprehensive, uncoordinated action. And for those of you, and I wish I was in a room with you because I would ask you by a show of hands, how many of you are working with survivors of intimate partner violence? what you know is that they become involved in many different systems, and those systems are often not communicating with each other. And so doctor services are often office-based, and they tend to be focused on a problem, not on strengths. Because really that's what the medical model is about, identify the problem and intervene with the problem. But we have adopted that way of thinking in our human service realm. So these are some of the invisible processes that are working that have shaped the way we typically engage in helping activity. Is this, does this resonate at all in the context that you're a part of, in your human service context? If anybody wants to throw something into the chat. Can you relate to the way the medical model, this way of intervening with people, is that a part of your human service infrastructure as well, or do you go about it very differently? And feel free to raise your hand too, and just jump in if you'd like. Unmute yourself. And if there's someone in the chat who can help translate for me, that would be awesome, Maria. If you see in the chat and you can help me understand what's there, that would be wonderful. Okay, well, feel free to drop things into the chat and we can bring this hopefully around when we have discussion. So, so how is advocacy different from traditional social services? And this is important. This departure is important. And when I'm training people in the US context, first thing we've got to do is get them thinking differently about the capacity and ability of survivors to be active agents in their own lives. So sometimes when we're training folks, the first thing we're doing is trying to unmask what they view as normal and allow for something new to come through. So when chief among these is that instead of viewing victims or survivors as sick or pathological, we believe they're reacting in adaptive ways to oppressive societal conditions, restrictive sex roles, and the abusive intimate partner in their lives. And so that's a deviation already, because we're not viewing this in terms of deficits. We're viewing this in terms of assets and adaptation. Advocacy is non-directive. So this is often very hard for human service folks to do. Even advocates who are movement oriented, to say, we're not going to be directive in this process. And we're also comprehensive, individualized, and holistic. So when we're working with survivors, we want to be thinking about that survivor in terms of her whole life and the complexity of her whole life, as opposed to just around the abuse that she's experienced, recognizing her as a whole person. So, okay, I'm going to pause for a moment. Great. So there is a comment here that says the experience that we have in Italy is that the more the different services collaborate strictly and coordinate with the support center for women, the more women experience an empowerment process. That's great. So it sounds too like in that Italian context, when you're overcoming some of that compartmentalization, it's a more effective response and a more empowering response for survivors. So in terms of the way that advocacy is different, we are survivor driven, not service driven. And then maybe this goes too to the comment that was just made, because what we want to do is work in service of whatever the survivor wants to work on. We do not believe that we're the experts. We focus on the survivor's strengths, and we really look to see and enact those strengths. And we also understand that violence could happen to any of us. So we're not interested in figuring out who are those women over there who end up with abusive partners. We recognize that could be anyone. And so we really want to resist the tendency to victim blame. So what do we mean by survivor-centered? We mean that we are working with and on behalf of the survivor, not doing for her and not doing something to her. And there's an expression here that we say, well, who's driving the bus? And every state in the United States has a coalition, and that coalition is responsible often for funding for our domestic violence agencies. And one of these coalitions in Pennsylvania, they created these little buses, squishy buses, like the stress squishies. And it had the saying on the side of it, someone drives the bus, but it's not us. And it was to remind the advocates that what you do with the survivor is not up to you. It is always, always, without exception, up to the survivor. Now, I have had people, when I'm trying to do training on this, say, well, I don't know what survivors you work with, but our survivors don't know what they want. And I would push back against that and say, did you ask? Did you ask in a way where you could hear? And so this is a critical part of the way we intervene. And I would say this is the single hardest thing for people to do in practice, for advocates to do in practice. Yeah. And so there's another comment here. In Iceland, things are so compartmentalized and tied to individual survivors centered, but with many limitations, especially related to women of diverse backgrounds. Yeah, I appreciate these comments very much. So if we use this analogy, and I would love it if someone would just unmute and jump in, and we say, you as an advocate are on the bus with the survivor. You are on the bus with her. What are you doing as an advocate if it's a survivor-centered process? What's your role on the bus? To use the bus analogy, hopefully this works cross-culturally. What are you doing on the bus as the advocate? Someone willing just to unmute and share an idea about that or drop something in the chat? Believe me, I get it. It is no fun to participate in Zoom. If we were together, we would get each other talking.
Nicole.
Go ahead, yeah. Yeah.
Wouldn't they just be actually listening? Listening.
Great.
And, yeah.
Yeah, so they might be on the bus really listening, deeply listening. And when we train in this model, that's one of the things that we've really spent a lot of time training on is effective communication. Mm-hmm. Deep listening, listening with intentionality. Absolutely. What else might the advocate be doing on the bus in a survivor-centered process?
I think it depends. I think it depends on who the survivor is. I mean, in our case, we work with marginalized women, and a lot of what we have to do has to do with explaining, you know, what's available, because a lot of women they don't have mm-hmm. knowledge about rights or services or what happens next, and you know, and also they mm-hmm. because they are marginalized, they don't know who to turn to. So a lot of what is there is that emotional and basically but information support.
Yeah, so you said a couple of critical things there. One, so there's the deep listening, and then there's emotional support, right? Saying, I'm here with you, I'm on the bus with you, I am with you on the bus. This is huge, this emotional support. And then the third piece of that is the information. So you can absolutely be the person on the bus holding maps, saying, we've been here before, this is how this worked. Sometimes people say, well, you could be the GPS on the bus. You can be someone who's helping someone navigate, but they decide the destination and they decide the path. And then you know what? If they decide they don't want to go to a particular destination, you just do another destination when they want to do it. And so it's a truly responsive process. Someone put in the chat, making sure the person's going in the right direction. And this is such a hard tension. I love that you put that in the chat, because many people feel this way, saying, well, what if they're making a choice or a decision that might really be harmful for them? And so, yes, you're going to still provide the information. You might even still go through pros and cons, but the direction is still the survivors. And so we have a really strict adherence to this idea that you can provide that information, but the decision-making is always going to rest with the survivor. We want to restore decision-making authority to the survivor.
If I could jump in again, I wrote
yes, go for it.
And that, you know, as activists, here in Iceland, there are so many things regarding women's survival and getting through this that are just not explained well enough. They're not put together. They don't exist. There are lots of things that don't exist. So as an activist, while we're doing the deep listening and we're doing that, we're also, I mean, we scourge for funding and for planning and for being able to provide something. And we just came out of having a peer support group, which it wouldn't have happened had we not been, you know, utilizing the information we're taking on the bus and thinking, you know, in rapid motion about what's not there and what needs to be there.
Yes.
So that's just to tie into the whole funding thing, because maybe I'm the crazy person with the ADD who is always trying to think about the next step while holding someone's hand, like, you know, or maybe even saying, Jesus Christ, we need this. Why don't we have this? So while it could probably crash the bus, it's necessary, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I want to come back to that because it's something that we talk about in the way. So I would absolutely echo what you said, that when you're intervening with any given individual, you should always have an orientation to the change that's needed in the systems and the resources themselves. And both things must happen at once. Now, sometimes it's too tall of an order for every advocate to be doing that, but there needs to be structure and an agency to do that. And I'm going to come back to that. It's a great point. Absolutely. Thank you all for participating in this Zoom space. I know it's not easy to do. So the survivor drives, the advocate guides, the advocate is an invited passenger. And this is the big thing we try to remind advocates when we train them. The woman can tell you to get off the bus anytime. That always needs to be in place, the voluntariness, her autonomy. And the other thing that's important in community advocacy is that we take a rights-based approach. So we say survivors have a right to control the decisions that affect their lives. They have a right to protection and safety. They have a right to use institutions as they see fit, like the police and courts, and they have a right not to. And we expect that the abuser will be held accountable, but that doesn't necessarily mean just through criminal processing. And they have a right to autonomy. And a rights-based orientation is very different than a needs-based orientation. It's very different than saying, well, she was needy, and so we had to do this. It's like, no, this person can have a reasonable expectation that the community is set up to protect them. And strengths-based. So I just want to say here very, very briefly, because I just want to be able to describe the intervention to you, and then we'll just get to questions and answers. That we want to avoid a pathology-oriented approach and we want a growth-oriented approach. And a key part of that is that we focus on people's strengths, assets, competencies, and skills. So we want to be engaging in intervention with survivors that activates what they are already doing that's going well for them. So that's building on their past experience, building on their skill sets, and increasing opportunity for the survivors based on their own priorities. And I want to just touch briefly on the theoretical or empirical basis for this. So this is not just accidental. It's not just that it's a nice thing to do or that it's consistent with our values, although that's sometimes true. But we're really basing our approach in community advocacy in two major theoretical approaches. And the first is ecological thinking. So the first is that we want to be thinking about people in the ecology of their lives. And I'll show a model of that in a moment. And we also want to be taking an empowering approach that increases survivors' control over their lives rather than decreases it, rather than takes it away through the way that we intervene. And this is an adapted model. As some of you may know, the ecological model and ecological thought is very central to community psychology. And this is an adapted model that talks about the individual in the context of their interpersonal networks, in the context of their communities, the organizations that shape and make up their communities, and then the policy environment. And I would say often out here, we think about the cultural environment as well. This is an adaptation of Bronfenbrenner's model. And we spend a lot of time when we train on community advocacy about what it means to think ecologically. So Nicole's comment where you're talking about the systems and their inadequacies. And you're thinking about the survivor's life, not just in terms of her individual choices, but in terms of the context of her family, of her immediate community. When you start thinking ecologically, and we spend a lot of time on this, you expand greatly the domain of intervention when you're thinking about advocacy. And most importantly, when we think ecologically, we are not thinking about changing the survivor. We don't have the expectation that survivor will somehow be different than she is when we begin advocacy with her. We want the community to change around her and that her to have some control in that process. And this is just another example, and I think Maria will share these slides, another application of the model thinking about sexual violence prevention work. And I'll share the slides with you so you have them. So empowerment, and I'm also not going to spend a lot of time here, but we do spend time on this when we do a fuller training, is to think about how do you build a truly empowering process in the way that you intervene. And I like this definition from Cataneo and Goodman, where they say, and it's an iterative process, right? So not something that happens once, but happens over and over, in which a person who lacks power sets meaningful goals toward increasing power, takes action, observes and reflects on the impact, draws on his or her evolving self-efficacy, knowledge, and competence. And this is something that we take very seriously in community advocacy, because we want to be a co-partner as an advocate in that evolution for someone, where they are setting goals and saying, I want to be here. But we're not saying, oh, you set that goal, you must follow through on it now. We're actually saying, what do you want and need? How can we walk together, work together to get there? And importantly, how can we change the community to be more responsive? So this is just another slide here that provides you an overview of some of the components. I didn't even talk much about the transfer of skills. That's an emphasis in the intervention. I didn't talk about trauma-informed. I do just want to highlight here that this is an intervention that is usually implemented by paraprofessionals. So the original research on this intervention was implemented by students at university. And this is something that does not require a professional degree. And sometimes people without a professional degree are even more effective advocates, because they don't have to overcome as much of the resistance as experts, right? That I know what's better for this person. So what about advocacy? I'm going to describe the intervention for you briefly, and then I'm going to stop for questions. I describe the underlying philosophy first, because it's really the heart of the intervention. But when we do community advocacy, what does it look like? It's community-based. It's a 10-week intensive advocacy intervention where we spend about 4 hours a week working with or on behalf of a survivor. And what I say is that when we are partnering with a survivor in advocacy, we are walking with her, doing with her, going with her. This is very hard to do in the context of the pandemic. People have had to make a lot of adjustments, right? Because we're not out and about in the same ways. And our goal is to help women protect themselves and their children, and of course, men, as the case may be, and to generate and mobilize community resources based on what the survivors report wanting and needing. And we also spend time, of course, as all who do intervention with survivors do, working on safety planning. And this intervention happens in 5 phases. And these phases are not just linear. These phases build on one another. So we start with a phase called assessment, right? And assessment is not like a clipboard. It's not like we sit with somebody and we do an assessment. It's a conversation. And in that conversation, we're thinking about needs and goals. We're thinking about the community resources that would meet those needs. Then we move to implementation. We generate and mobilize community resources. We figure out who controls the resource and how best to approach it. When the resource doesn't exist, we think about how to create it. This goes to the comment about how do we generate more funding? How do we do this? Because we're always creating at the same time that we're advocating. When we advocate, we realize there's unmet needs in this system. We can't just focus on survivors' constant adaptation to an inadequate response, but also need to be thinking about how we improve the quality of that response. Throughout the course of that intervention, we monitor, how is this going? Did we obtain the resource? What needs are met? How are the survivors' priorities changing? If we notice there needs to be change when we do that monitoring, we adjust, and we call this secondary implementation. And importantly, we focus on what we call completion. This intervention has a beginning and it has an end, and it's intensive. And completion is our emphasis and our focus when we start thinking about intensively transferring the skills of advocacy and self-advocacy with the survivor. So we want to be working ourselves out of a job the whole time in the way that we approach advocacy. There's a lot more detail that we share, but I want to come back to this important point that was raised earlier, which is that there's an individual-based intervention where you're working with or on behalf of a specific individual, but simultaneously you must be focused on institutionalized advocacy. Because what you don't want to do is the same intervention over and over again with survivors over and over and over again without trying to affect change in that system. So that might involve that coordination, that the comment in Italy around coordination. It might involve creating more responsiveness in responding systems that have not been doing a good job in responding. It might be engaging entirely new partners in education, in business. It might be changing laws and policies and seeking allies in that process. But you really want to have organizational space that is not just about providing an individual level service, but also thinking about how to shift the systems, formal and informal themselves. Yeah, so we have the intention of creating community level change. And I do want to say that this intervention has an empirical base. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but to say there has been more than one true field experiment. So where survivors were assigned to a services as usual control group, or they were assigned to work with an advocate intensively for 10 weeks. And what we found is that after the intervention, 6 months later, the survivors who worked with an advocate for 10 weeks were more likely to achieve their goals. They were less likely to be physically assaulted. They were less likely to report depression. They were more likely to report a higher quality of life. They were more effective at mobilizing the resources they needed, and they were more successful at separating from the partner when that was what they wanted. And these findings, and this is what I find the most exciting about this study, persisted for even 2 years after 10 weeks of working with an advocate. There was a 24-month follow-up. So it wasn't just an effect that we saw right after the intervention. It was an effect that we saw even 2 years later, where women who had worked with an advocate were better off than women who had had services as usual. I want to say really quickly, and then I just want to stop for questions. Shouldn't the goal be leaving? I always feel compelled to keep this here because in my experience, at least in the US context, people often think that success comes when the survivor has left the abuser. And sometimes if that is what the survivor wants, that's an excellent outcome. But what we do know is that even for women who separate from an abusive partner, it does not end the abuse necessarily. Leaving can be very dangerous, can be very fraught. Survivors have many, many reasons for remaining in an abusive relationship. And this is a hard thing for people to manage as advocates because often they feel like that's the goal. The goal is she goes, that's success. And we want to emphasize always in advocacy that that is not the outcome that we're pushing for. And of course, if it's what the survivor wants, 100%, we're going to be there. But we never, ever want our services to be contingent on whether or not a survivor is staying or leaving. And we want to adapt to whatever that reality is. And the other thing I feel compelled to say always is that in the United States context, we have relied way too heavily on criminal justice response. And I don't know the status of that in Brazil, in Portugal, in Italy, and Iceland, how much that's been brought in. But in the United States, the movement really beginning in the 1980s, the anti-violence against women movement, really started emphasizing accountability through criminal justice. And of course, this has been a very problematic focus because as you probably know, the United States has a profoundly biased criminal justice system. It disproportionately imprisons Black men and men of color. It is not a just system. And so this has come into conflict a lot, that there's a heavy reliance on accountability through the criminal justice system that is not itself an equitable system. And in the US context, it is women of color, and I'm happy to share these resources, who have done, I think, the most profound work on community accountability, rather than a reliance on a criminal justice accountability. So I say this because in the US, there's also a tendency to push people toward criminal justice remedies. Oh, call the police, get an order of protection. Many of the women that we work with have no interest whatsoever in engaging in the criminal justice system, and we would never make our work contingent on that either. So importance of underlying philosophy, we change the context, not the survivor. The survivor guides, the advocate supports. We do intensive comprehensive intervention. We look for lasting positive change, and we want to make the community more responsive. So that is where I'm going to leave it. And I think we still have some time for questions. And these are some links here. And I know we'll provide the PowerPoint presentation. I did not have a lot of citations throughout, but you can find a lot of the original research and papers in the site that I have here for supporting evidence. And this particular citation that I have here is work that Chris did that's actually, it was able to download it, right, as a PDF. And on the supporting evidence page, many of those papers are available via PDF. You should just be able to download them if you want to see them. So yeah, so I thank you all for your kind attention, and I welcome your questions.
Oh, I want to jump right on because I want to jump with your last note, Nicole. Here in Iceland, I don't want to make us sound like a backwards place, but things really aren't moving at the speed that they should or the rate that they should. And we're a very systems-based country. And what's happening is they're making, they're making advancements regarding intimate partner violence and sexual violence and criminal violence, but it all is tied into, especially when it comes to marginalized women, the criminal justice system. What can we do at this point while they're building things up and tied into it? I mean, there are women who literally cannot leave violent relationships if they don't go through the criminal justice system because their not citizenship, but their residence permits are tied to the violence and the insurance system, the health system. It's all sort of weeded through that you go first to the police. We're not in the same situation as with all of the discrimination in the thing, but the criminal justice system isn't working on the other end. We have human rights going to the human rights court for people who don't get their justice on the end, but all of our services to get to that end are tied in. So if a woman wants to leave and she wants to get her social welfare benefits to get a home or whatever, she has to go through this system, but it doesn't guarantee her the criminal justice at the end. What can we do to guarantee that things don't escalate, move in that direction where things are in the States, with what do you want to say? Attention to the fact that the way that it's set up in order to get your survival, your package, your support to stand on your own is tied into it. Did you get that? I talked in a circle.
I totally get it. No, I think it's an incredible, incredible question that we will not solve in the next 13 minutes. But I do, for years, my own research has focused on how to create change in the criminal justice system. And so I was a person that was like, yes, let's think about how to make this a more responsive system. And in some ways, I still believe that's important because I do think that law enforcement in the United States have played a critical role at times in interfering in what could be lethal violence. And so I don't want to say today, criminal justice, it's all bad, drop it, it's not relevant. I think it is still relevant, but I think that the other question, there's two things I want to say. One is us asking ourselves, what are our other mechanisms for community accountability? And in the US context, I think the work of the Insight Women of Color Network has been phenomenal. And I will send that citation. Maria, if I send you some materials, maybe you can get them to the group. Because they're taking up the question, what does community accountability look like outside of our outsourcing accountability to the criminal justice system, right? So how do we engage faith-based communities? How do we engage other civic group, other organizations? On our campuses in the United States, we have this Greek system, fraternities and sororities, and they're very risky places. But what would it look like to create community accountability in fraternities? What does men's effort to hold other men accountable look like? So I think there's a big question here about accountability that has to be taken up And I think people doing transformative justice work are taking this up, and it's really very beautiful work. The other piece I want to say is that knowing nothing about Iceland, I'm very reluctant to say this, but I do want to say that based on my own experience, if someone is asking me about the US context, I would say never yoke resources to reporting. Never say you can get this other stuff, but you must report. And this is a chronic tension, because part of why people compel reporting is they say, if you want us to hold this person accountable, you have to tell us. Otherwise, we're going to do this over and over and over again. Is that what you want to do?
Right.
But the problem with that is the burden is so much on the survivor. And often those criminal processing systems do not result in safety for the survivor. They do not result in justice for the survivor. And so you've put all the onus on the survivor to say, you must come report to us because we need to keep the community safe. And if you want these things, you have to come through us. I say, give them all the things, all the resources, all the mobilization that's needed, but do not make it contingent on reporting or participation in criminal processing. So if I would work on the unyoking those two things, and then really taking up, like, how do we have goals in conflict? Because I'm sympathetic to the folks who say, we want to have reporting because we want accountability. If you want us to say in Iceland, this is unacceptable, part of the way we do that is through criminal processing. That's the way many countries do it. And yet it's likely not going to be the way that we find our way out, I think, of this. I think we need to be affecting culture and norms and men's accountability with each other and so on. So it's a wonderful, complex question. I'd be happy to connect about it again. I think about it a lot. I think about it even on college campuses. So, you know, feel free to email me. Yeah. Other questions or comments? Go ahead, Maria. Oh, Maria, you're muted still.
Not for long, but that depends on the risk level. And the other question is if you work with the abuser too. And there's respond to these two. And there's another question before that I'll report to you.
Yeah. The question does that depend on the risk level? Is that with regard to reporting?
Yes.
Sarah, are you willing to unmute? Okay. So, I mean, what I would say is that my feeling is we should have an effective criminal justice response that a survivor can engage when she feels it's called for in her life. So I am not saying we should cut survivors off from that. What I am saying is that we should never compel her to report in order to get the things she needs. It's a form of coercion, right? We have a system here we have a huge child protection system in the US. And sometimes people would say to me, well, it's good when the survivor gets reported to Child Protective Services because we can give her more resources if she gets reported to Child Protective Services. And my feeling is, why don't you give her the resources without her having to be reported, right? Why must we create these barricades? So I would say that I would never compel reporting, because my feeling is the survivor at the end of the day, she bears the brunt of that system and its consequences, and the decision is hers about involvement. That may seem like an extreme view. Believe me, this could be debated. I get it. I don't personally do work with abusers. I think that work is incredibly important. There are models for working with full families. Julia Peria, who did a lot of work with the Latino community here, Latinas, and she would use a family-based approach to, she'd have groups for women and groups for batterers simultaneously, recognizing the centrality of the family. So there are models, but community advocacy focuses on the survivor. But if the survivor said, I really want to work on employment options for my partner, we would work on it. Maria, you're still muted, yeah.
Another comment says, use more future memory recording right after to gather the survivor's testimony at the beginning of the process. Would you comment on that?
Oh, in terms of documenting her experience? Yeah, I think that I think this is, again, something that can be guided by the survivor. I think if the survivor wants to do that documentation, wants to have assistance in that process, I don't think that that's necessarily bad. However, I don't know what your laws are like about the subpoena of records. For us in the US context, I would not want that documentation to live in a case file that the courts could order me to give to them. So I would think carefully about where such information gets stored. The reason is that sometimes women recant for their safety. Sometimes the safest thing for a survivor to do is to say, I made it up. And in the US, in certain places, women were starting to be held in contempt of court and arrested for filing a false police report because of their recanting, because they changed their story. And so my only concern about heavy documentation would be that if you document my story and it ends up in someone's hands and I can't back away from it for my own safety, that would concern me. But I don't think it's inherently problematic, especially when a survivor wants that support to help her document. I even had a survivor once who I interviewed as a part of a research study. And she contacted me and she said, I remember you said I could have my transcript. I want it because I need help remembering what happened. And she had a right to that transcript, and we provided her with her interview because it helped her remain anchored to what was happening in her life at the time. So I think there can be value in that.
There was a prior question about what the children, if the bus has space for children, if the bus could have children in it too.
Yeah, so we had a whole intervention that we did where we had advocates assigned to the kids as well. So the advocate actually worked with the kids and did that in a youth guided way, worked on the things the kids wanted to work on. My experience working with survivors, if the survivor has children, her wants and needs almost always involve the children too. Extremely common to have wants and needs that are related to the kids. So the kids are almost on the bus by default. And I would say that if you do advocacy with children, which is absolutely possible, that I would consider having more than one advocate work with the family, an advocate who can focus on the kids and an advocate who can focus on the moms. Because one of the things that we found is that when we were focusing on advocacy with the kids, moms' wants and needs can become secondary to the kids. And so it can be a lot for a single advocate to manage. So that's just a structural thing to think about where you might want to have more than one advocate. But yes, kids are definitely on the bus and they're an important part, I would say, of the vast majority of mothers we've worked with, their decision making. Yeah.
We're almost reaching the end of our time. If there are more questions or comments to Nicole. There's one more here. Let's see. Okay. All right. I would also would like to, you mentioned at some stage that you are now evolving to, you were a believer of the transformative judicial system, but you feel now that it's more powerful to have women survivors as the center of transformative of the systems change. How do you envision a successful future of that result?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that we need to do, I've done advocacy since 1995 is when I was introduced to this model. So even when I was working on criminal justice reform and we were trying to think about institutionalized change, for me, the survivor-centered piece was always key. What I've become less confident about is the ability of that system to ever be the space that helps us achieve an accountability that puts an end to this form of violence, right? So I think that centering survivors' priorities and wants and needs keeps us on the right track for this work. And then it brings our attention to educational opportunities, employment opportunities. It brings our attention to bringing in partners in all these different spaces that shape cultural narratives, faith-based settings, other organizations where people live and participate, workplaces. you know, educational spaces, then these all become targets for intervention around cultural transformation. And I think survivors should have a voice in all of those processes. If we anchor in their experiences and what they wanted and needed from family and friends and community and what didn't happen, that guides our next step. So I love your idea of a peer network, because I think if you can organize survivors so that they have a maximum voice in that process, I think that will guide in the right way, you know? So that's not a great answer, Maria, but it's definitely part of the way that I think about this, which is how do we center survivors' experience and that's part of what advocacy is good at, because it helps us focus on the survivors and think about the systems change needs based on their experience. And so I am by no means saying we still don't need to work on criminal justice. I do think we do. I just think it will never be our way out. It will never be sufficient, even if it's necessary, for true cultural transformation in the context in which interpersonal violence breeds. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for this intervention. Are there any more comments or questions to be made at this point?
Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right. I would also like to thank very much Nicole for this presentation. I think it was, as usual, you're a wonderful presenter and a wonderful human being and a wonderful professional and researcher, so many things. And we admire
thank you for having me.
For 30 years that we are already, I think we know each other from the 90s, I think, somewhere there. And so we are very much, we did appreciate your time here and your offering this time to us. This project is, you're just the starter. You're like the first presentation. We will be having a cycle of presentations, and we are very, very proud that you accepted to be the first and the face of the process. And so we thank you from our hearts for this presentation. It's always inspiring and reminding us where should we stand is in a community-based approach is our life. And so we believe we are on the right track, but we always need your inspiration. Thank you. Thank you to all the attendants, to everybody that was here, and all we are here presenting. We couldn't have done this without the support of our funders first, and also of the technical team at ISPA that also provided us with an enormous investment and support for us to be here and have these participation and all these messages of thanking, yes, very much to everybody. Felizmina, thank you so much for your cool presentation. We are very grateful for your presence. And at this stage, we are ending our session. Thanking you all again very much for your participation. Bye. Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Very inspiring. Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.